our children do not know, and when I say our children, I mean our white children and our black children, do not know the dimensions of racism. They do not know the consequences of slavery. They do not know the special circumstances that attended the black presence in America. And therefore, it's not easy for them, or for the rest of us, to understand why black folks in some ways have a special claim on the attention of American society.
You do not disturb the deceased. You leave our people alone. You let them rest in peace. And if these reasonable and just demands are not met, then at the very least, we should do everything that we can to stop the construction of this building.
In the little village in Arkansas in which I grew up, there is a black burial ground, and it was in existence during slavery. I never thought that something would emerge in New York City.
I know I have friends who describe the Atlantic Ocean as their Auschwitz. And they do so because it's their belief that many of their ancestors are dead in the Atlantic Ocean. The Middle Passage speaks to this, that arduous journey that Africans took against their will. It all really deals with that place that separated us from our homeland.
New York City, on Manhattan Island, was once a primeval garden of ancient woods, rocky outcrops, rolling hills, and freshwater lakes. The Dutch were the first Europeans to settle here, and with their presence, the native people were pushed outside the new walls, and a written history began.
As the English arrived and the culture changed, the island Manhattan was also transformed physically as the hills were leveled, the coastline expanded, and the lakes filled.
The written and visual record also grew. There are many images of the founding fathers,
but few images of the men and women who built its foundation. New York finally emerged as a great city of the United States. Its written history is long, but also incomplete.
History is a subject that relies primarily on the written record. Thus, it has a tendency to overrepresent literate elites and to underrepresent those persons who are not literate. African Americans would not have as much documented history as other groups because African Americans were not the producers of documents. More than that, the documents that were produced by African Americans were not preserved in a systematic way.
When you think about the way in which history is recorded, it tends to focus on people who can either write themselves or who are important enough to be written about.
African Americans were nearly 20% of the population of colonial New York, but in the historical record, largely missing or distorted.
Most of these African Americans were enslaved. In the summer of 1991, an unexpected and remarkable discovery deep beneath Manhattan's streets offered a new chance to reclaim some of this lost history.
There is references to the area in terms of black cemetery, but I didn't know what that meant. I assumed that there was a cemetery that apparently was in what was the then southern part of the Collect, which was in fact the freshwater pond that was there at the outset back in the 16th, 17th century. I kept thinking, I wonder what they're going to find.
On the architectural drawing board, a 34-story federal office building was being planned. It was to be built on land purchased from the city of New York by the United States government.
When did we know about the Negro burial ground, as it is called in the old papers? In the environmental impact statement, which the government is required to do, they turned up a map that showed the existence of the, quote, Negro burial ground. And the map clearly showed that the burial ground extended, not only covered the site of the 290 Broadway building, but extended for many blocks. The feeling, however, was, and there were many references to this in the documentation, that while the cemetery had existed, that it was no more in existence.
When test excavations were begun, we were hopeful that we might find some remains from the burial ground, but we weren't particularly optimistic. Every single lot within that block had had a building built on it in the 19th or 20th century. When you looked at it, your initial reaction was there can't possibly be anything left.
Archaeological testing for remains or evidence of the burial ground continued at the site through the summer of 1991. As the summer neared an end, no conclusive evidence of the burial ground had been found, but one location showed promise.
The very corner of an alley that existed on the lot called Republican Alley, that had always been an alley ever since it was first developed in the late 18th century. We knew no buildings had ever stood on that alley, so we thought that would be a good place to start.
And there we thought there may be 1, 2, or 3 graves. The government never foresaw the amount of skeletons that would be found there. And it is very important for us to understand that had we foreseen this, we perhaps would have taken a different course of action.
Early in October of 1991 came first word of a discovery to the public. Within days, the official announcement was made. 11 bodies had been found.
From Fox 5, this is the 10 o'clock news.
It's a graveyard right in the heart of downtown, and it's already surprising some historians. Jeff Weiser has more in this exclusive report.
Mystery is being literally uncovered in Lower Manhattan. While government officials have withheld comment and have sealed the site from the public, Fox News has learned that archaeologists have discovered a historic site at this location at 290 Broadway, where a federal office building is scheduled to be built between Duane and Reed Streets.
There, more than 20 feet below Manhattan's streets, was a remnant of the oldest cemetery of African American men, women, and children ever found in a North American city. The cemetery was in use from the early 1700s and perhaps earlier.
The first decision we were faced with was how to remove the skeletons, and I gave the instruction that they would be treated as a very important archaeological find, no different than a find of this nature would be in the ancient world.
The discovery sent historians scurrying, trying to determine why the surface of the cemetery was so deep below the city and how the burial ground itself had been buried and undetected for more than 200 years. At first, archaeologists thought they might find as many as 20 or 30 bodies. But as work proceeded, it soon became apparent that many more would be found.
It was, according to the early reports, thought to be a very small site with a very small sample of individuals, of skeletons.
It wasn't until we found out through excavations that the original ground surface in that area sloped down quite sharply from Broadway towards the east, towards the freshwater pond that had been there, that we knew that the ground surface was still intact underneath all of those later buildings, and that the burials beneath that ground surface were still there. We knew there would be hundreds of intact burials on this site.
By December of 1991, more than 100 individuals were found. A month later, the skeletal count was nearing 200.
Broadway, one of America's most famous boulevards, was once a hilly wagon path west of the Collect Pond. This freshwater lake bordered farmland and the burial ground, which was outside the city limits. Since blacks were considered outcasts, they could not be buried in the all-white cemeteries.
After the Revolutionary War, the city's industrial growth caused the pond to become polluted. The hilly area around Broadway was leveled, and as the earth was moved to fill in the pond, it also covered the burial ground.
This was an area of the city that was reserved mainly for African Americans. In the 18th century, black people were not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground, so this area was reserved for them. As you can see, we're over 20 feet below grade level here, and in order to get down to these depths, we use a variety of equipment. We use these very large backhoes to get down the 20 or so feet until we get down to the level where the burials start to exist. Then we use smaller hand tools such as shovels and trowels, and eventually we get down to the real intricate work where we're using dental picks and small brushes and a variety of small equipment like that.
The unearthing of the burial ground will provide new information of great importance to both archaeologists and historians.
As a historian, when I start thinking about the question of the relationship with archaeology, I'm aware of something, that they are providing information which is going to oblige myself and other historians to begin understanding that we have a vast new source of evidence at our disposal, which we don't fully know how to use. And archaeologists are therefore going to be in the position of having to instruct us. So the archaeologist is simply saying, look, we dig, we find, and this is what we find, and this is what we can more or less tell you about the nature, for example, the way in which these people lived.
This site is the first 18th century urban African-American burial ground that's ever been excavated. No other burial ground from this time period has ever been examined. I would say that this is probably one of the most important historic sites to be excavated in the United States.
What's exciting about skeletons is that they provide access to a level of information that is not available in any other way. We can analyze bones, and we can find out what people's health was, what their diet was, what sorts of diseases they died of. We can tell at what age men died and what age women died, and we can get a lot of really direct information about people's lives. It's a very direct and meaningful kind of information.
Just as a living population provides a special insight on a living society, the presence of the people themselves does tell us a great deal.
This kind of information brings us down into the nitty-gritty level of life, and that is the life of most people. What I think has primarily been the traditional problem amongst historians. Historians, until social history was invented, tended to think about the people who were important because they counted. They were the ones who made history. And the fact is, they were the froth. In short, they were the people who liked to think they made history.
I think in looking at the site, what we have to bear in mind is that this is a very historically obscure group of people. We know virtually nothing about them from historical sources, so their physical remains are in effect documents that are telling us about the past. We've excavated almost 300 individuals on this site, and out of that population, around 45% appear to be children or young infants. 30% are infants below the age of 2, and a further 15% or so are children below the age of puberty. Of the remainder, around 2/3 of the adults are male, and around 1/3 are female.
In this burial of a woman and child, the woman is buried with her infant. Her arm was found shaped around its remains.
As the wood of a coffin decomposes, it leaves in the soil a dark line. This subtle deposit is the first sign of the location of the burial.
You can also see the organic staining here from the coffin, which continues down right to the bottom of the grave pit. You can see nails here that would have been used to nail down the lid.
Excavating the area is very difficult because there are a large number of graves very close together. Some are on top of each other.
We have a protocol which we use to try and define where in the coffin the burial actually is. And initially we try and uncover the top of the head, and then we try and uncover the legs. And this gives us a good sense for where precisely in the coffin the individual is.
It's important to get as much information as possible in the field, taking data from the skeleton in situ, that is, in place, because as you may be able to see, these remains are very fragile, and it's not possible to avoid fragmentation of the bones as they're removed and wrapped.
The two most fundamental characteristics of a human being are age and sex. These are the initial properties that anthropologists, scientists who study human culture, try to determine when excavating a burial site.
One examines the teeth for a variety of reasons. Teeth give some indication of age, and they also provide indicators of pathology and nutritional stress. So for children, you determine age in large part by the extent of their development. Aging is also influenced by the environment, the work stresses that the individual underwent. In a young person, the vertebral body would be flat, more or less, straight across the margins. But here you see the margins are elevated, and actually they lip or fold over.
Dr. Blakey's field analysis suggests a man in his 30s. The ridge of bone or lipping of the spine, caused perhaps from years of work and strain, is more like someone in their 80s.
I would be inclined to think that this degree of lipping is more of an environmental, stress-related phenomenon. This is a lot of lipping for someone in their 30s.
How are the bones?
Not very good. You can see how soft the ribs are in here. The ends of the bones are also very soft in the areas where the bone thins out. There's been some tooth loss before death.
The skeletal remains can also indicate the sex of an individual, which helps develop a demographic profile, a set of vital statistics about the population. In this excavation, twice as many adult men as women have been found.
The way sex is determined is based on a number of factors. One is differences in the shape of the pelvis. There's an area called the sciatic notch, which is a different shape in males and females. There's an area called the pubic symphysis, and there are differences in the shape of that in males and females.
This is possibly a female individual, and she would have been about 18 and very robust. I do find that they lived in a much more physical world than we ever will, and they're stronger individuals and more hardy individuals. And although their lives were so hard, it would be very nice to be that powerful as they were, even though they were perhaps abused for being that robust.
The condition of the skeletons varies greatly. Some are virtually intact, while others have nearly completely vanished through the natural decomposition process. In some cases, burials have been intruded upon when another person was buried very close by, and some were disturbed by building construction in the 1800s.
In conducting an excavation, any kind of excavation, in essence what you're doing is destroying the material's context as you remove it from the ground. So what we have to do is make a complete a record as possible. And in this case, what we're doing is making a very detailed scale drawing of this burial, so that theoretically we could in fact reconstruct this burial ground completely. In essence, we know the precise location in space of every individual buried here.
And the other kinds of information that you can get from cemetery populations have to do with the way people are treated at death. And were men buried the same way that women were? Were children buried the same way? If their bodies are oriented in a certain direction, are all of the people oriented that way? Are the coffins different from one to another, and so on?
The overwhelming number of burials were discovered with the head oriented to the west.
The theory being that on the Day of Judgment, these individuals would sit up in their graves and face the rising sun, that they're also facing Jerusalem, and in the case of the African Americans here, they're also facing Africa.
Special interest is taken in the number of children found, since about half of the burial ground population is under 12 years of age.
We know that children were imported as slaves directly from Africa. We know that certainly those who were born in New York as slaves lived at the convenience of the people who presumed to own them.
Most of the bodies uncovered were not accompanied by grave goods or material possessions. Their clothing at the time of burial was often just a simple shroud.
In the very early stages of the project, we found one individual who had military buttons from a British Marine officer's coat. And we've had 3 examples so far where coins have been placed in the individual's eyes. This is a cultural practice where pennies were placed over the eyes to keep them closed at the time of death. And then these coins were thought to have unlucky connotations because they had been in contact with the dead, so they were buried with them.
Most were buried in plain wooden coffins. Some 10 to 15% were placed in the earth with no coffin at all.
There's not much evidence on this side of any kind of violence. We had one individual who had a musket ball in her ribs. That presumably was the cause of death. But apart from that, I've seen very little evidence of the kinds of fractures that might be associated with violence, such as fractures of the bones of the hands or of the rib area.
We take care for measurements in the field in case there's damage to the bones as they're transported or excavated. And we also get preliminary analysis as to age, sex, and race from our assessments.
Determining the race of an individual from their skeletal remains is a difficult and problematic issue.
We determine racial characteristics by looking at various differences that are apparent, usually in the cranium, in the skull of an individual. There are certain characteristics which indicate or suggest that people were of African ancestry or Caucasian or Oriental or whatever. Out of the total population that we've looked at so far, by far the majority seem to be of African ancestry. We have a couple of examples of individuals who may or may not be white. I mean, there's some degree of dispute about that, and they may be individuals of mixed race.
The determination of race is a very complex and troubled issue. In essence, race does not exist in nature. It is a social construct that has been imposed upon populations that in essence involves taking a few characteristics and defining whole populations in terms of those characteristics. So that if one defines a Negroid as an individual who is more prognathic, that is to say, who has a more forward-projecting lower face, then you can measure the skeleton, and in that sense, you've assigned the individual to a particular race, with all of the overlap and ambiguities that will come even with that kind of definition. But we can come up with fairly close approximations of the facts. That's a very long way from the paucity of information that we presently have on the life of Africans in this area during the 18th century.
This individual, as far as we can tell now, is a female and is wearing, she was buried with 2 beaded bracelets. On the right wrist, there was a bracelet consisting of alternating green and white beads. On the left hand, so you can see a few dark beads here. They continue up in here. Dark blue, kind of rounded glass beads with some white glass beads on the strand.
Through the archaeological process and later analysis, the significance of field-reported information can change. It was later determined that the beads were not parts of a bracelet, but were actually a lace of beads around her waist. For the scientists, such personal information adds a human dimension to their work with the remains.
This individual has filed front incisors, both the upper front and the lower front incisors. The first incisor, to be right here, is filed into a gradual, like an hourglass, a gradual hourglass. And the second incisor, which would be right here, is filed into a peg shape, where both sides is filed. It's almost like a point, but it's more like a dull peg. This indicates tribal affiliations to West Africa, where this was practiced amongst certain tribes.
From my own perspective as a father of young children, I find it sometimes very moving to look down on the remains of young infants and children and speculate on what might have happened to them if they'd lived.
One gets a general impression of his face as being, I think, very pleasant. I think that this man would have had fairly striking features in the development of his brow, a fairly strong brow, as they sometimes say. This is just the sort of thing that one thinks about while doing the science, while sitting at the side of an ancestor, trying to understand who that person was, how they lived, what life was like for him or her.
In October 1992, some 200 years after the cemetery had been closed, the archaeological dig was permanently stopped due to community and political pressures. More than 400 individual skeletons had been removed from this small preserved area of the cemetery, which was once much larger. Experts estimate over 10,000 men, women, and children were once buried here.
At the peak, 65 archaeologists worked to reclaim this historical site. Soon, laboratory examinations would begin to reveal even more. The discovery will have a profound impact on our historical perspective of those buried and will constantly remind us of those enslaved, unwilling American immigrants who were nearly forgotten.
The discovery of the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan has become a catalyst to tell the story of how all Americans helped build our nation. Few Americans realize that Europeans, natives, and Africans have lived and worked here since the earliest days of colonization.
African Americans, both free and enslaved, lived here for nearly 200 years before the United States even existed as a nation. When independence from Britain was won, African Americans helped win it. Throughout those centuries, African Americans struggled for their own freedom in American society. But that freedom was long in coming.
Nowhere is the story of freedom more compelling than within the history of one of America's greatest cities, New York.
Following Christopher Columbus's final voyage in 1502, other European explorers continued to search the coast of North America. Within a generation of the Columbus voyages, numerous points along the eastern seaboard of North America were being touched and investigated by seafaring non-natives.
The first European to ply the waters around Manhattan Island was an Italian, Giovanni da Verrazzano, in 1524. The inhabitants then were a native people who called themselves the Lenape, a native word meaning the people.
No European presence existed on the island until 1609, when Henry Hudson, an English explorer in the service of Holland, established the first contact with the native people.
There's some indication that there was, from the very moment that the first Dutch settlement was attempted in a trading sense, that there was at least a black here.
The first non-Indian, non-Native American inhabitant of Manhattan Island was a man named Jan Rodriguez, who arrived in New York in 1613, early part of 1614, with the very first traders, just a couple of years after Henry Hudson. And he was put ashore at his own request and given some pots and pans, and he established a small trading post. With Jan Rodriguez comes the first black presence, and he would be therefore the first resident of New York City.
Following Jan Rodriguez, the island's first merchant, more traders arrived to build and develop a growing colony which required an expanding workforce. The Dutch soon established New Amsterdam, a trading post for furs.
The slavery of African Americans in New York City, or really on Manhattan Island, predates the development of New York City. The Dutch, when they were here in the overall colony of New Netherland, introduced African Americans as slaves in the 1620s.
Well, during Dutch rule, Negro slaves or enslaved blacks were brought to the island Manhattan principally as substitutes for the labor needs of the Dutch West Indies Company. And so they brought in enslaved blacks, many of whom were Africans, to people the land, work on the farms in and around Lower Manhattan.
Those farms grew food for the colony. The main economic activity of New Amsterdam was the valuable fur trade. Beaver furs were in great demand in Europe, and each month thousands of pelts reached New Amsterdam from inland trading posts. At first, the Dutch colony grew slowly, unlike the English colonies in Virginia and Massachusetts. Those were agricultural economies requiring large numbers of workers. Those colonies also received a steady stream of new immigrants in pursuit of religious freedom. New Amsterdam's strength was commerce, enticing for profits merchants and traders, but few settlers.
By 1640, just 500 people lived in the tiny village, a community of shops, a few dozen homes, and several warehouses belonging to the Dutch West India Company. One, the Negro's House, provided shelter for the company's enslaved men, women, and children. It stood where a towering office building now stands at 85 Broad Street.
Many of these slaves came from the Congo-Angola region in Africa. Others came from Brazil, having been captured and enslaved during an earlier period in the slave trade.
Those enslaved Africans, some with previous experience building colonies in Brazil and South America, did much of the arduous work of building a European-style town in New Amsterdam.
African Americans have contributed culturally and economically to the development of New York City in almost every way you can imagine. If we go back to the original Dutch settlements, we're talking about a people who built the fort, built the roads, built the bridges, built the houses.
New Amsterdam's enslaved labor force also cleared land for farms and shore areas for docks. Former Indian trails were broadened to accommodate horse-drawn wagons. Enslaved farm workers oversaw the colony's farms for absentee Dutch owners, planting, harvesting, and managing the day-to-day operations. These farming skills would soon win something very valuable for some of New Amsterdam's enslaved population, their freedom.
At that time, the Dutch colony was suffering the depredations of war. The Director General Keith had begun what turned out to be a lengthy war against the Indians, and that war depleted the Dutch West Indies Company's resources, and at this time, the shrewd Negro men petitioned the Dutch Company again for their freedom of their families.
On February 25th, 1644, the New Amsterdam Town Council freed a group of enslaved workers, 11 men and their wives, and gave them grants of farmland on the condition that they help provide food for the colony.
Their names, like Simon Congo, gave memory to their African homes. The children of these men and women remained as slaves.
The land they were given had been abandoned by white farmers. It became known as Negroes' land, or the land of the blacks. Eventually, some 40 farms in all, spanning more than 2 miles of lower Manhattan, covering 100 city blocks. A 19th century historian termed the region the Negro Frontier, writing that the Negro Frontier enables us to trace by record, evident to the precise period when the primeval forest covering the most populous part of our city was first submitted to the axe of civilization and converted into clearings and fence enclosures. Slavery also affected the eventual dominance of the island by a new European power. In 1664, English men of war appeared off New Amsterdam and demanded the surrender of the Dutch colony to English authority. Defense was hopeless. Dutch Governor Peter Stuyvesant had too few soldiers and few food reserves. In addition, the arrival of the West Indian Company slave ship Gideon, with 290 enslaved Africans on board, only a few days before the appearance of the English fleet, further taxed the colony's food supply. The settlement could withstand a siege for only a few days.
On the Monday morning of September 8th, the English naval force took control of New Amsterdam without firing a shot. Director General Stuyvesant watched as his army of 150 soldiers boarded the empty slave ship for the trip back to Holland.
The English changed the colony's name to New York. Under English rule, the colony grew, bringing a substantial increase in the number of enslaved men, women, and children.
It's under the English that slavery is going to grow to a proportion whereby the middle of the 18th century, one might say that maybe between 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 of every person on Manhattan Island was an African American, and for the most part, those African Americans were enslaved.
The 18th century, during the British occupation, was one of extreme repression for both black people and natives or Indians in New York City.
New York City's slave laws were more strict than any other colony in the North and comparable to the slave codes of the South.
Some persons like to note that the person who was Duke of York, later to become James II, was a holder in the Royal African Company, or the Royal Company of African Adventures, which was the initiating slave trading entity for the English.
And what the English did was introduce racism into New York, and they did that by passing legislation which in fact made the black community outside of the law. That is, they could not hold property.
Slave owners were allowed to punish their human property for certain offenses without trial, and to dispense any punishment except death or dismemberment. Persons in bondage could be whipped up to 40 lashes.
The British passed laws that said that more than 3 or 4 blacks could not congregate on a corner. There were no social and legal laws that protected blacks, neither slaves nor free people of color. Blacks who had owned property during the Dutch period lost that property. It was confiscated by the government.
In 1712, the colony passed a law which denied free blacks the right to inherit land. Within 4 years, the last farms owned by free blacks and the Negro frontier were sold. Already in decline, the prominence of free blacks diminished further. For the next 50 years, the city's black population was overwhelmingly enslaved. Enslaved blacks were required to have a pass to travel more than a mile away from home. For many, that was about the distance from their homes to the cemetery located outside of town. By 1712, the burial ground was in use, although it may have started in the 1600s.
As the enslaved population grew, so did the burial ground, eventually covering 5 to 6 acres, or about 5 city blocks. Local laws also affected burial practices. There could be only 12 mourners, no more, and burials had to take place during the day. They were not allowed at night, the customary time for many African burial rituals.
When we look at the slave laws in New York, one of the elements that we have to look at was the concern of the enslaving society about the potential of violence among African Americans. And that potential was realized rudely, if you like, in 1712, when 25 to 30 or more African Americans unleashed an uprising, burning some outbuildings and killing 10 to 12 whites and injuring another dozen or so. This fear of uprising prompted very severe reprisals. 6 died during the capture. The other 19 were some hanged, some burned, slow roasted, in fact, some broken on the wheel and left to die.
That revolt was one of the first massive slave revolts in British North America.
By 1712, New York City's economic activity and general population had grown significantly. The city ranked 3rd behind Boston and Philadelphia, with trading ties to countries all over the world.
You needed people to work, and you needed labor, so you were caught up in a kind of dilemma. The dilemma was solved by racism. It was solved by introducing these social laws and ostracizing the black community. Now you can have your cake and eat it too. Now you can have people work for you, but they're no longer a threat, or at least they're kept under control.
By the 1720s, slavery had become a routine part of life in the New York colony.
There were several slave markets in New York. Perhaps the most notable is the market that now is at the site of a famous financial market, and that is the market at Wall Street. Routinely, slaves were landed at the dock at Water Street and marched up to Wall to stand on the slave blocks and be auctioned off.
You look down the South Street Seaport area, that was the harbor. You go down there, and what you can literally see is the world that made this city what ultimately became the great port entry into New York. Now, if you're going to have shipping, who's going to do the work? Load the ships, unload the ships. Well, it was a combination, black and white.
Some of them, anyhow, were in fact Indian. There was an Indian slaves, there were mulattoes. It's a whole list of different kinds of people who were slaves. But they were about 20% of the population. They did a lot of manual labor.
Naval records from the early 1700s show that most enslaved workers, about 60%, came to New York from the English West Indies. About 40% came directly from the west coast of Africa, principally the Guinea coast, and some from Madagascar on the east coast. Traditionally, some historians have maintained that slavery in New York and elsewhere in the North was more benign than in the South.
One is not, I think, at liberty to say that slavery in the antebellum South was of a different character than slavery in New York City during the colonial period. Slavery is slavery. The person is deprived of his or her personal liberty, is treated as chattel, so the essence remains the same. The point to be made is that slavery is slavery. There's no benign slavery.
In fact, In some ways, Northern slavery was even more socially restrictive.
Negro slaves in the colonial South were generally segregated into slave quarters, some distance removed from white authority and control. In contrast, enslaved blacks in colonial Manhattan lived under almost constant surveillance from white authority figures.
An adult female slave would most likely begin her day by preparing breakfast. She would then most likely move on to her daily chores, that is, after helping the lady dress. Indeed, if you go back and look at the ornate costume of the early 18th century, you can note immediately the need for both males and females to need the service in dressing if they were to put on the full regalia.
Often skilled and semi-skilled enslaved blacks worked as sailors, carpenters, blacksmiths, shiploaders, seamstresses, and servants.
In the decades before the Revolutionary War, New York began to develop culturally. Some of its citizens were sounding the first bells of American freedom from Britain. A New York publisher, John Peter Zenger, had stood his ground about the right to criticize the government, and the first battle for American freedom, freedom of the press, had been won. New York's African Americans began to hope for freedom too. A short distance from Zenger's weekly journal office, renewed resistance among the enslaved population was about to ignite one of America's greatest slave uprisings.
And that is the Great Negro Plot, or New York Conspiracy, of 1741, in which 35 persons were in the end executed. What happened was that there were a series of suspicious fires, which lasted for about 3.5 weeks. That destruction caused people over time to think that the slaves were engaged in some widespread conspiracy. An investigation, which eventually took 6 months and was accompanied by a prosecution, was then begun and did reveal widespread unrest among African Americans. The end result was that 31 blacks were executed, 17 hanged, 14 burned at the stake. If you can envision this, a large pole was driven into the ground, and around it was placed kindling and firewood, and a person was chained to that stake, and it was lighted to the huzzas and cheers and oars of the assembled congregation, who took such executions as sort of public holiday. People would kind of pack lunches and come down and watch. The executions were probably somewhere in the general area of what today is City Hall Park, where we're now sitting. And the remains of the individuals who were executed, some of them certainly are in the Negro burial ground.
In 1776, American commanders anticipated a British assault on New York City and issued orders to fortify the town against attack. The slave force did much of the work on those defenses. General George Washington arrived with 18,000 soldiers, standing ready for the expected British invasion.
British and American troops clashed at the Battle of Long Island. The far larger British force of 25,000 soldiers forced Washington to retreat back to Manhattan. General Washington's force was able to hold off the British at the Battle of Harlem Heights. But in the face of the massive British army, Washington abandoned Manhattan. For the remaining 6 years of the war, New York City endured British control.
Many enslaved blacks responded to Britain's promise of freedom in return for military service.
The British proclamations offering enslaved blacks freedom during the War for Independence were actually extraordinary acts of war. As many as 10,000 black refugees came over to the British side during the War for Independence. Many of those found their way to the city of New York during British occupation.
As the war raged on, the New York Assembly finally responded in 1781 to the British promise of freedom by offering freedom to all enslaved blacks who would serve in the colony's armed forces.
It's interesting that perhaps more African Americans fought on the side of the king against the Patriots because the king's forces had promised them freedom and liberty after the war.
In November 1783, blacks who had fought with the British were given freedom and passage to Canada. They were evacuated by British ships, along with thousands of loyalists and English soldiers. The former colony's independence challenged some of the new states to re-examine the slavery issue. By 1784, Vermont, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island enacted laws to end slavery. The struggle in New York took longer. In 1785, John Jay and Alexander Hamilton formed the New York Society for promoting the manumission of slaves. Many of the society's members manumitted or freed their own slaves. The city's steadily growing free African American population continued to grow.
The African Free School started in 1787 as a boys' school. 2 years later, there was a girls' division. 2 years after that, there was a division for adults.
This plaque commemorates the site of Mother Zion AME Church, the first black church in New York City. From the Dutch period during the 1600s, blacks had been worshipers in white churches. However, in 1797, they were tired of being treated as second-class citizens in white churches and started the Mother Zion AME Church.
When you start talking about Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. What you have to understand is that obviously there's an ambiguity here, if not a bloody contradiction, and that is having a portion of the population enslaved, which clearly means that their condition is obviously not one of equality.
By the end of the 1700s, New York City's population had grown to more than 60,000. About 10% were black, a third of whom were free. In 1799, the state passed a law providing for the eventual freedom of all its black residents. The law gradually gave freedom to all black children born after July 4th, 1799. Females would become free at the age of 25, and males at the age of 28, delaying New York State's Emancipation Day until July 4th, 1827. When full freedom was finally won, 28 years later, these newly freed Americans founded a newspaper, Freedom's Journal. Having gained emancipation, they now began a struggle for equality.
At 150-152, Church Street was the offices of Freedom's Journal. Freedom's Journal was the first black newspaper in the United States.
Despite these new opportunities, New York life became rigidly segregated. Politicians openly courted newly arriving European immigrants. They offered opportunities for jobs and housing to the new immigrants, pushing the older African American community into a second-class citizenship.
Anyone coming to New York City in the early 19th century would have immediately realized all public transportation segregated, all restaurants segregated, all theaters segregated, whatever education existed segregated. Everything was segregated. And the intensity of the need to segregate, to separate, was in a sense trying to somehow maintain the legacy of slavery, which was the ostensible inferiority of the formerly enslaved. And New Yorkers were well equipped to handle it that way if they were white. And New Yorkers who were black had to labor against how to keep this from becoming an overwhelming liability.
By proclamation on the 4th of July, 1827, every person who was enslaved in New York was at that time declared to no longer be enslaved or to owe service to any holder. However, it's not really until 1841 that the presence of slaves in New York is completely done away with, because until then, through loopholes in the law, visitors or travelers could bring slaves into New York City, New York State, and maintain them as such during a temporary residence. So we might really say that it's not until 1865, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, that slavery in New York is abolished.
This is what historians can tell us about the African American role in New York's history. The next chapter of this history will be told by those who analyze the remains and the artifacts found at the burial ground, enabling us to uncover and discover more about the uniqueness and cultural richness of our nation's history and heritage.